In Chapter 11, we want to spend some time talking about natural selection. Natural selection is oftentimes considered the mechanism that causes evolution to occur, the mechanism by which evolution occurs. Natural selection occurs because populations in the natural world have four different properties that are listed on our slide. So first off, individuals within populations vary. They vary in their appearance, in their size, in their physiology, in a number of different characteristics. Number two, some of the variation that we see in these individuals can be passed from parents to offspring. Not all the variation can be passed from parents to offspring. We realize that organisms change in terms of their phenotype throughout the course of their lifetime based on the environmental factors that they encounter. But nonetheless, much of the variation that we see within individuals can be passed from parents to offspring. Number three, populations of organisms produce more offspring than will actually survive. This means that only the best of the organisms, and so what by best in this case we mean only the organisms that are most fit, in other words, best adapted to their environment, will survive and produce offspring. And this is okay as far as the survival of the population goes, because there are many more organisms that are produced than are actually needed to ensure survival of the population. Number four, survival and reproduction are not random. Those organisms that actually get to reproduce are organisms that have certain characteristics that make them well adapted to their environment. All these factors contribute to this occurrence that we know as natural selection. Let's look at number one, the first characteristic that allows natural selection to occur. Individuals within populations vary. And so we see a tremendous amount of variation in the natural world in populations that are found in our environment. Wolves are an example that we see in Part A of Figure 10.6. Wolves have a tremendous number of different coat colors that makes them more or less adapted, more or less fit for their environment. We see that flowers have different blooming times. Some flowers bloom very early in the year. For instance, our wildflowers here in central Kentucky in our temperate deciduous forest bloom early in March, before the leaves on the trees are out yet, and therefore those flowers have light available to them while they're reproducing. So all populations in nature have a tremendous amount of variation. Number two, some of this variation can be passed from parents to offspring. So it's well established now, and you understand even based on our previous chapters in this class, the mechanism by which variation can be passed from parents to offspring. We know that we have genes. Genes code for proteins, and proteins determine the appearance or the phenotype of an organism. Darwin was one of the first to notice this. Probably not the first, but he noticed that people could breed animals and get certain phenotypes in those animals based on the animals they selected for breeding. This picture of a fan-tailed pigeon in Figure 10-7 is an example. There are no fan-tailed pigeons in the natural world, but fan-tailed pigeons are an example of an organism that humans have produced as a result of selective breeding. We take the pigeon that has the tail that sticks up the most and breed it with another pigeon that has a similar tail, and we get offspring that have tails that stand up, and through many breeding events we end up with organisms that have very distinctive phenotypes. So it's clear that much of the variation that we observe in the natural world can be passed on from parents to offspring. Number three, populations of organisms produce more offspring than will actually survive. And so this is true even of slow breeding organisms like elephants. Darwin put together an estimate of how many elephants would be produced if they were allowed to reproduce for a number of generations, and it was clear from his estimate that there was nowhere near enough land in Africa to support the number of elephants that would be produced as a result of these breedings just through a couple generations, assuming that every elephant survived. And so the key is that all elephants don't survive. And elephants are perhaps the most extreme example of a slow breeding organism. A 2-year gestation period, don't reproduce until they're quite old. If we look at many other organisms in the natural world, they produce a tremendous number of offspring very quickly. A large carp, a type of fish, can produce 1 million offspring per year. 1 million in just 1 year. And so clearly organisms produce more offspring than there is actually space for in the environment. And so this certainly contributes to natural selection. Finally, point number 4, survival and reproduction are not random. And so we use the term fitness to describe how well adapted an organism is for its particular environment. the more fit an organism is, the more likely it is to pass on its genes to the next generation. Adaptations are characteristics of animals that affect fitness. And so certain adaptations will increase the fitness of an organism in a particular environment. For instance, the Arctic fox has very long white hair. And so that is an adaptation that greatly increases the fitness of that particular organism in its environment, in cold, harsh environments where there's snow on the ground much of the year. It would not be very fit in the southeastern United States, where there's not snow much of the year and where it's very warm. So, what we see is that all these characteristics allow natural selection to occur. There are more organisms produced than what the environment can support, and so those organisms compete for the available resources, and only the organisms that are most fit, in other words, have the best adaptations for that environment, are able to survive and reproduce. Interestingly, many adaptations that organisms possess don't just affect survival, but they do affect reproduction. And so oftentimes we see that organisms have adaptations that have nothing to do with survival, may even impede survival, make it more difficult to survive, but it does make it more likely that they will reproduce. And so one of the most interesting examples of this, I believe, is a bird referred to as the widow bird, shown in our upper picture on our slide. The widow bird is found in the western United States, and male widow birds have long tails. Why they have these long tails was not known until this series of experiments were done. Of course, anytime a male has some sort of showy phenotype, we would guess that it is to attract a female. A very simple but interesting experiment was done to test this hypothesis, and the experiment is depicted in the lower right-hand portion of the slide. A number of widow birds were caught and divided into three groups. A number of male widow birds were caught and divided into three groups. In the control group, the tail was not modified. The tails were left the same length. In one of the experimental groups, the tails were shortened. Very simply, they cut the tail feathers so that the males had short tails. And in the other experimental group, an additional portion of a feather was glued on to the male's tail so that he actually had this tail extension, had a longer tail than he would normally have. And interestingly, what's depicted in our graph here is the reproductive success of those males. And so what you see is that the control group, in the males that had a non-modified tail, they made a nest approximately one time that particular year. And so they found one female, made a nest, and raised a group of young from that nest. The males with shortened tails only made a nest about half the time, so they were only successful in finding a female who would build a nest with them about half the time. In the case of the birds, the male widow birds that had tail extensions, they produced almost 2 nests per year. And so clearly the females were impressed with those longer tails and more likely to mate with those males that had the longer tails. And so those male widow birds were able to find 2 females on average per year, build 2 nests, and raise 2 groups of offspring. So keep in mind, in the natural world, organisms always behave as if their major goal is to produce offspring, to get their genes onto the next generation. And so we see that these adaptations then facilitate that process. So presumably the phenotypes that we see in many male organisms in the natural world, such as our brightly colored wood duck that we see on this slide, are a result of what we refer to as sexual selection. The females look at the options that are available and they choose the option that they feel is most likely to allow their offspring to reproduce and to do well in the environment. So females look at those males and they make a choice based on who they feel has the best genes. Interestingly, this is often referred to as the handicapped principle. And so this means that these birds, such as the widow bird, have these bright, showy feathers and they have very long tails, and it makes it much more difficult for the birds to survive. It'd be much easier for a predator to find and capture those birds with these bright, showy feathers and long tails. And so the female looks at that and says, well, this bird, this male is surviving even though he has this disadvantage, even though he has this long tail, even though he has these bright colors. And so he must be pretty strong. And so I will choose to mate with him in hopes that my offspring will also be fairly strong. At least that is one of the current hypotheses that's used to try to explain this process of sexual selection.